Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
They say people never forget their high school years, and maybe that's true. But what they don't tell you is that some people never let you forget yours either. Especially when you're stuck sitting across from your sister at a family brunch on a humid Sunday in late June, while her perfect husband wrangles their smug little kids. And your mother pours mimosas like it's a competition to see who can pretend everything is fine the longest. I knew something was coming. I felt it before I even knocked on the front door that morning, wearing the same dress I wore to my office holiday party 6 months ago, trying to look like someone who was doing just fine. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment my sister tilted her head, looked at me with that rehearsed little pout, and said, "You peaked in high school." It's sad, really. She said it between bites of French toast casserole, with syrup still on the corner of her mouth, like she hadn't just sliced open 10 years of my self-worth in one sentence. My mom chuckled nervously, like Emily had just quoted a line from a sitcom and not just demolished me in front of everyone. Dad didn't even look up from his plate. That silence stung more than the insult. There are moments when you realize you've been cast in the same family movie your whole life, just with a role you didn't audition for. I was always the almost prom queen, the almost daughter worth bragging about, the one who got a full ride to college but dropped out after a year because life got messy, because the man I thought I loved decided I wasn't enough, and because I had no one back home telling me it would be okay to come back and start over. Meanwhile, Emily, sweet, bright, always polite Emily, finished grad school, married well, bought a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, and popped out 2 shiny little kids who had matching lunchboxes and homemade Halloween costumes. And somehow, despite everything I tried to do differently, I always ended up here. In this kitchen. At this table. Letting her cut me open like it was nothing. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't have words, God knows I had plenty, but because I'd learned the hard way that in this family, the louder you get, the easier you are to dismiss. So I picked up my plate, walked into the kitchen, and started washing dishes like it was the most natural thing in the world. The water was too hot. My hands turned pink. My throat burned. I could hear them still laughing behind me, like nothing happened, like I was invisible. That was the moment I decided I was done playing along. I dried the last plate with a towel that smelled faintly of bleach and lavender and turned to grab a stack of forks from the island counter. That's when I saw it, a small manila envelope, half tucked into Emily's open purse, the flap loose. It was barely noticeable, except for the crisp black text on the corner, Office of the Attorney General, State of Illinois. Now, I've never claimed to be subtle, but I've always been good at reading a room. I didn't reach for it. I didn't ask questions. I just stood there for a second, letting the sound of my mother telling a story about some neighbor's dog fill the space behind me, and I stared at that envelope until the words burned into my brain. Attorney General. That's not something you get junk mail from. That's not a dentist bill or a PDA flyer. That's serious. I wanted to grab it. I wanted to confront her right then and there, throw it on the table and say, "Guess who's peeking now, sweetheart?" But instead, I did what I've learned to do best. I waited. I bided my time. I smiled when Emily came in and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I said the dishes were therapeutic. I even laughed when her kid ran in with syrup on his shirt screaming about a bee in the backyard. But something had shifted in me. Not just a spark of curiosity. This wasn't just about whatever was in that envelope. This was about everything she'd taken from me with that one sentence. She didn't just insult me, she reminded me that everyone in that house still saw me as the girl who had her moment and wasted it. She was so confident in her position at the top of our little family hierarchy that she didn't think twice about kicking me while I was down. And I'd let her. For years, I let her be the golden child, the one who got credit for being stable, responsible, impressive. But what Emily didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while she was out there crafting a perfect life to show off at brunches and Christmas photos, I'd been learning, watching, remembering. And now, with that envelope as a breadcrumb and her careless words as gasoline, I finally had something to burn it all down. I went home that night and opened a bottle of red wine I'd been saving for nothing in particular. I poured a glass, sat on the couch, and stared out the window at nothing. My phone buzzed once, a group text from Mom. "Thanks for a lovely brunch, girls. So proud of my beautiful daughters." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Beautiful daughters. Equal on paper, unequal in practice. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and started typing Office of the Attorney General Illinois plus Emily last name. I didn't expect to find anything, not really. People get letters all the time. Maybe it was a mistake. A scam. A notice about something small. But part of me hoped it was bigger. Because if I was going to make her pay for that moment, for that comment, for the years she made me feel small, I needed more than just revenge. I needed leverage. And as I clicked through the first link and saw her name appear in a paragraph under a subheading about pending investigations, my heart started to race, not with fear, not even with anger, but with possibility. Because maybe I had peaked in high school. Or maybe I was just getting started. I didn't sleep that night, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't understand. The search results hadn't told me much, just a vague mention of a pending investigation involving multiple parties connected to a real estate deal under legal scrutiny, one of those dry, lawyer-crafted sentences that say everything and nothing at the same time. But nestled inside all that sterile language was a single name that made me sit up straighter. Emily Crawford Hunt. My sister. The one with the big backyard and the Pinterest birthday parties and the handmade soaps in her guest bathroom. The one who had just, hours earlier, leaned across a platter of organic bacon and told me I was a washed-up relic of a better decade. And now, suddenly, that same sister was on the radar of the Attorney General's office. I spent the next 2 days pretending to live my normal life, sitting through pointless Zoom meetings at work, nodding along as my boss explained for the third time how the new collaboration portal would revolutionize our project management system, making small talk with coworkers about the weather and pretending I didn't have a storm brewing in the back of my head. I answered emails, signed off on invoices, even made polite conversation with my ex-husband when he called to ask about some mail that was still getting delivered to my place. But every free moment, every break, every second I wasn't being watched, I was digging. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, maybe just some confirmation that I hadn't imagined it, that this wasn't some clerical error or an unrelated person with the same name. But the deeper I dug, the more I started to notice cracks in the perfect porcelain of Emily's carefully curated life. It started small, a comment on a local neighborhood forum about a zoning issue, with someone mentioning Emily's name in passing, saying she'd pushed too hard for permits on that Montrose project. Then a half-deleted article on a regional business blog about complaints filed against a handful of agents tied to a luxury condo development. Still nothing definitive. But in each of those places, her name floated near the surface like oil above dirty water. What really got my attention, though, was the email I found buried in my spam folder on Wednesday morning from someone named Jay Rodman, who claimed to be a freelance reporter covering government corruption and financial misconduct. He said he'd come across my name while searching public family records. Apparently, my father's retirement fund and my sister's real estate holdings were linked on a public asset registry, and he was hoping I could comment on the unusual financial relationship between your sister and your father. I didn't reply, not right away. I just sat there, staring at those words, unusual financial relationship, wondering what exactly Emily had been doing behind closed doors, and more importantly, why no one had said anything about it. I called my mom that night under the guise of checking in on Dad's follow-up appointment. She sounded tired, distracted, but still managed to tell me that Emily had driven him to the neurologist and that everything was fine. That word again. Fine. In our family, it was less of a description and more of a deflection, a warning not to poke any deeper. But I poked anyway. I asked if she thought Emily was handling everything okay. She paused for a second longer than usual, which told me everything I needed to know. Then she said, "You know how your sister is. She likes to be in charge." I hung up soon after, poured myself a glass of cheap red wine, and opened my photo app. I still had access to the old family group chat, the one we'd used for years before Emily started texting Mom separately and ignoring my messages. I scrolled back through the photos, found a few from high school, me in my cheerleading uniform, standing beside Dad on the football field, grinning like the world hadn't yet figured out how to break me. I picked 3 and sent them into the group with a short message, throwback to better hair and no mortgage. It looked innocent, playful, even nostalgic. But I knew Emily would see it for what it really was, a shot across the bow. The reply came 30 minutes later. Mom sent a heart emoji. Dad sent nothing. Emily, however, responded with a passive-aggressive masterpiece. Yes, the glory days. Some things never change. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I could practically hear her teeth grinding through the screen. The next morning, she blocked me on Instagram. That's when I knew I had her attention. And that's also when the message came in, not through text, not from anyone I knew, but from a burner account that had only one post and no profile picture. The message said, "You don't know what you're messing with. Stop." No name, no explanation. Just a threat, cold and direct, like a slap across the face. For a second, my stomach dropped. I'm not proud of it, but I felt real fear. The kind that creeps into your spine and makes you second-guess everything. Maybe I was poking around too much. Maybe I'd stumbled into something bigger than just petty sibling revenge. Maybe Emily wasn't the only one who had secrets to hide. But the fear didn't last. It never does when you've already lived through worse. After everything I'd been through, the failed marriage, the lost career, the silent dinners with a father who stopped looking me in the eye 10 years ago, I wasn't about to back down because someone with a fake account told me to. Still, I knew I needed to be careful. This wasn't about getting even anymore. This was about getting clarity. About finally understanding what had happened to my family and who my sister really was when no one was watching. I started compiling everything, screenshots, articles, forum posts, that weird email from the journalist. I even downloaded a digital backup of Dad's old property records, something I hadn't looked at since the bank account transfer we did after Grandma died. And there it was, buried in a stack of PDFs, a legal transfer form, signed and dated less than 6 months ago, naming Emily Crawford Hunt as sole beneficiary and trustee of Dad's estate. No mention of me. No co-signature. Just Emily, holding the pen, and Dad's scrawl underneath. I stared at that document for a long time, trying to understand how it had happened. He'd always been cold, yes, but to cut me out entirely? Without a word? Without even a conversation? It didn't feel right. And maybe that's what pushed me over the edge, not the insult, not the envelope, not even the cryptic messages or half-buried news articles. It was the simple, brutal fact that someone had erased me from the story of my own family. And I wasn't about to let that slide. I printed the document, folded it twice, and slipped it into my desk drawer. Then I opened my phone and called the number listed on the email from J. Rodman. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, deep and cautious. Hello. I cleared my throat. You wanted to know about my sister? I think it's time we talk. There is a particular kind of loneliness that grows not from the absence of people, but from the persistent presence of people who see only the version of you they've already decided they understand, a type of grief, almost. For the self you never got to become, because someone else had already filled the role you were supposed to play. That loneliness lived with me for years, quietly, like a tenant who paid no rent but never left, and it had a name, one syllable drawn in a mother's softer tone and a father's approving silence, Emily. She was never overtly cruel, not in the way that leaves bruises or screams echoing in the hallway, but in the more insidious way that makes you question your own reality. That slow drip of favoritism doled out with such consistency and subtlety it becomes invisible to everyone but you. When we were little, she was the one who got the new dresses, the better seat in the car, the praise at dinner when she ate all her vegetables without being asked. I got hand-me-downs and, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" said with a half-smile that was meant to be playful, but landed like a slap. At the time, I convinced myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was stronger for being the one who had to fight for attention, who had to speak louder, try harder, stay up later just to be seen. But now, as I sat alone in my apartment days after that warning message, looking over legal documents and half-written notes from a reporter who seemed to know more about my father's affairs than I did, I began to understand something I'd been too proud to admit before. The truth wasn't that Emily was smarter or better or more deserving. It was that Emily learned early on how to manipulate the story, how to smile while claiming territory, how to let others believe they were making decisions when really, she was placing the options in their hands. My sister didn't succeed in spite of anything. She succeeded because the game was rigged from the start, and now it looked like she was using the same strategy to reshape our father's legacy. I needed clarity, not just about the legalities of the estate or the odd connections between her name and that investigation, but about the family dynamic that allowed her to walk through life as if she were untouchable. So I drove out to the house we grew up in, not with any clear plan, just an old instinct to return to the scene of the crime, to the place where the unspoken hierarchy of our family had first taken root. Mom answered the door in her robe, her hair pinned up like she had been cleaning or maybe crying. It's hard to tell with her, since she wears both sadness and denial in the same expression. She smiled, surprised to see me without warning, and I told her I just wanted to visit Dad. He was in his chair by the window, same as always, staring out at the backyard like it held answers to questions he was too tired to ask. His hands were trembling slightly, that familiar shake that had worsened over the last year, but he still held his chin high, the old pride stitched into his spine like it might hold his whole body together if he just sat still long enough. I sat beside him, said hello, tried to ignore the awkward silence that always fell between us, not hostile, just empty. A void filled with things we'd never said. After a few minutes, I asked him about the estate, careful not to sound accusatory, framing it like a logistics question, just something I needed to understand in case anything happened. He didn't respond at first. He just kept looking out the window, then eventually said, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, she said it was easier that way. Less mess. I wanted to scream, to ask him when I became a mess, to demand why he had allowed her to take over everything without so much as a conversation. But instead, I asked, and you believed her? He didn't look at me. He just nodded once, and that was the last thing he said that day. Mom made tea later, and while we sat in the kitchen, I asked her point blank if she knew Emily had taken full control of Dad's finances. She blinked at me, genuinely confused, and said, "What are you talking about? Your father made those decisions. He told me it was to make things simpler." And there it was again, simpler. The word they used when they meant, without you. I pressed harder, mentioning the transfer forms I'd found, the name of the investigator, the questions that had started to pile up. Her face changed then, slightly, like a veil lifting, but she quickly pulled it back down with a sigh and said, "Honey, Emily's just trying to help. She's always been the responsible one." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so goddamn familiar. That same phrase, repeated over and over again through the years, like a song I never liked but couldn't stop hearing, the responsible one. I left shortly after that, making up some excuse about traffic and deadlines, but the truth was, I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. It was like being trapped in a scrapbook of someone else's perfect childhood, every corner polished, every photo curated to leave out the shadows. Back at home, I listened again to the recording I'd made of my father's voice during our last visit, the one where he mumbled something about less mess. I looped it, trying to decipher what emotion was buried beneath the words, guilt, resignation, fear? Or something else entirely, something I didn't yet have the language for? I wrote an email to the journalist, told him I was ready to talk, that I had more information, that I wasn't sure what it all meant, but that I wasn't going to let my sister write this story alone. Then, just after midnight, my phone lit up with a message I hadn't expected. It was from Emily. 3 words. "Call me now." And beneath it, one more line, almost frantic. "Dad's shaking and can't speak." The air went still around me. For a full 10 seconds, I forgot how to breathe. The revenge I'd been plotting, the truth I thought I was inching toward, all of it vanished in that moment, replaced by something colder, heavier, more real than I was prepared to handle. I picked up the phone, heart pounding, already knowing this wasn't just a health scare. Something was unraveling, and we were running out of time. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights, horn blasts, and half-formed thoughts spiraling into a knot at the base of my throat, a tangle of guilt, suspicion, fear, and something darker, something I didn't want to name yet, not out loud, not even to myself. It was well after midnight when I pulled into the parking lot, the sodium lights overhead casting everything in that clinical orange hue that makes even the most ordinary places feel like something sacred has been broken. I don't remember grabbing my bag or locking the car door. I don't remember the walk through the automatic doors or the look on the nurse's face when I said my father's name, but I do remember the hallway, long and sterile, stretching endlessly toward the room where he now lay, a man once made of concrete now reduced to something small and twitching in a hospital bed, covered in thin blankets and surrounded by the beeping language of machines. Emily was already there, seated stiffly in one of those molded plastic chairs, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face set in that neutral, composed expression she wore whenever she needed the world to believe she was in control. She didn't look at me when I walked in, didn't greet me, didn't say my name. She just stood up, smoothed the fabric of her cardigan like it mattered, and nodded toward the bed where Dad was half-curled, hands trembling, eyes darting from the ceiling to the wall to the four-tube, as though each detail might hold the answer he no longer had the words to give. I moved closer, unsure whether I was meant to speak or listen or simply exist in this room as a placeholder for someone he used to know better. For a while, none of us said anything. Eventually, Emily broke the silence, her voice sharp but low, as if she were afraid of being overheard by the machines. He had another episode. His speech is almost gone now. Doctor thinks it might be neurological, something layered on top of the Parkinson's, maybe a small stroke, maybe worse. We're still waiting on imaging. Her tone was clinical, detached, too composed for the situation, and I couldn't help but wonder whether she'd rehearsed the lines in the car, sculpted her delivery into something that sounded both informed and selfless. But it didn't quite land. Not for me. I nodded slowly, sat down next to the bed, and reached for Dad's hand. His fingers were cold but still strong in that ghost of a firefighter way, the grip faint but present, like some part of him was still holding on. He turned his eyes toward me, pale, glassy, watery, and tried to move his lips, the sound he made barely a whisper, something broken and half-formed, not a word but the shape of one. I leaned in closer, forehead nearly touching his, and he tried again. This time it sounded like safe or maybe save, the vowels muddled and stretched, the consonants lost entirely. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to say something comforting or reassuring or even demanding, but the truth was, I didn't know what he was asking of me, and I wasn't sure I could give it if I did. Behind me, Emily cleared her throat. "He's not making sense," she said, too quickly. "Don't try to read into it." I turned around then, and something in her face, the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes didn't meet mine, made me feel suddenly, absolutely certain that she was reading into it and didn't want me doing the same. There was something she didn't want me to hear, or worse, something she already knew and was terrified I might piece together in this room, with our father barely clinging to language and memory. I asked her how long it had been since the symptoms worsened, and she deflected with some vague timeline about the last few weeks, claiming she didn't want to alarm anyone, that Dad insisted he was fine, that she only brought him in tonight because he finally collapsed. Her explanations were neat, too neat, and I could feel the unease growing in my chest, not just because of her words, but because I recognized the choreography of her deception, the same practiced calm she'd used when she used to lie about stealing my clothes, the same wide-eyed innocence she wore when the teacher called home about something I supposedly did, when in fact it had always been her, always her with the clean hands and the dirty strategy. The doctor came in around 2 a.m., young, polite, speaking in careful tones, confirming the worst of what Emily had already told me. That Dad's condition was likely a combination of progressive Parkinsonian symptoms and vascular damage from an undetected stroke, that they were running more tests, but his capacity for speech and motor control would likely continue to deteriorate. He talked like someone who'd given this speech 100 times before, full of quiet sympathy and unavoidable outcomes. When he left, the air felt thinner. Emily started to cry then, soft at first, then harder, a shaky, practiced sob that sounded just a little too clean to be fully real. I wanted to believe her grief. I wanted to feel what I was supposed to feel as her sister, as his daughter, unity, shared sorrow, that aching bond of familial pain, but instead I felt something colder, something sharper, something like suspicion crystallizing into resolve. I watched her wipe her eyes and look at me as if waiting for me to fall into line, to fold myself back into the family script where she cried and I comforted, where she took and I forgave. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared back at her and let the silence hang heavy between us. Later, while she stepped out to take a phone call, or maybe to rehearse another scene, I opened Dad's phone, still in his jacket pocket, and scrolled through his recent calls. One number stood out, not because it was frequent, but because it wasn't familiar: Donna R. I recognized the name only vaguely, a name whispered in childhood conversations, one of Dad's old coworkers from the firehouse days, someone I hadn't thought about in decades. There was a voicemail next to it, dated 3 days before the hospital. My thumb hovered over it. I pressed play. His voice crackled through the speaker, faint and slurred, but unmistakably his. Jenna. I didn't mean to leave it all to her. I was scared. Talk to Donna, not Emily. Then a long pause, and the sound of him coughing, and then the click of the line going dead. The walls of that hospital room suddenly felt like they were tilting. Everything I'd been wondering, everything I'd suspected, everything I'd refused to admit, it was no longer just theory or paranoia. It was real. He had left it all to her. Not because he thought she deserved it. Not because she asked. Because he was scared. Of what? Of who? I put the phone back in his pocket before she returned, my face blank, my mind racing. If Emily was hiding something, then whatever it was had started long before that brunch, long before the envelope, maybe even long before she ever said I peaked in high school. And now it was time to find out what Donna knew. Because whatever truth my father had choked on before the stroke, whatever secret he buried in silence, she might be the only person left who could help me dig it up. There are moments in life when time doesn't just slow down, it distorts completely, curling in on itself like scorched film, leaving you suspended in a kind of emotional vacuum where everything you thought you understood, about people, about history, about your own place in the world, starts to bend under the pressure of revelation. That's exactly how it felt the moment I heard my father's voice crackle through the weak speaker of his outdated cell phone, his words rasping out like a confession he never meant to leave behind, a whispered map drawn too late, pointing toward a name that hadn't been spoken in our family for years, one that belonged to a person I barely remembered and had never really known: Donna R., a woman whose presence, even when she was still around, had always existed at the edge of things. Like the smoke from a fire long extinguished. After leaving the hospital that night, or morning, rather, since the sky had already started bleeding into a sickly gray by the time I stepped outside, I sat in my car with the windows rolled up and the air stale, listening to that voicemail again and again until every syllable felt etched into my skin, until I could hear his breathless voice in the spaces between the words, and until I no longer needed to play it to remember it. He hadn't just been trying to unburden himself. He had been trying to undo something he either did under pressure or deeply regretted afterward, and that something, as far as I could tell, had everything to do with Emily. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of returning to my quiet apartment, of sitting on my couch surrounded by the cold comfort of my own bitterness and half-formed theories, felt unbearable. So I did what I always do when I don't know where else to turn. I drove. I didn't have an address for Donna, just a name and a fragment of a memory, something about a ranch house near the old firehouse, a dog with one ear, a porch covered in wind chimes. It was flimsy, useless even, but I held on to it like it mattered because I needed it to. Eventually, after some social media digging, 2 white pages trials, and a very awkward phone call with a man who turned out to be a different Donna's third husband, I found her, Donna Richardson, age 73, retired, still living in the same town. just 2 blocks away from the place where my father used to spend more time than he ever spent with us. I didn't call ahead. I didn't give her the chance to hang up or prepare a script. I just drove straight there, my knuckles white on the steering wheel and my mind screaming with possibilities. When she opened the door, I recognized her instantly, not because she looked the same, she didn't, of course, but because she had that same energy I remembered from when I was 8 or 9 years old. Sitting in the back seat of Dad's truck while he dropped off some tools at her place, the way she looked at him like they shared a language the rest of us didn't understand. She looked surprised to see me, but not shocked, which told me she knew this day was coming. We sat on her porch, her dog curled up at her feet, and I told her about the voicemail, about my father's condition, about the feeling I had that something was deeply wrong, not just legally or financially, but morally. Something that couldn't be fixed with apologies or paperwork. At first, she stayed quiet, sipping her tea and nodding slowly, like someone who'd been rehearsing the right moment to unburden herself for years. And then, finally, she spoke. "Your dad never wanted Emily to be in charge," she said, her voice low and certain, like it wasn't an opinion, but a fact she'd memorized. He knew she was smart, sure, but he also knew she was ruthless. He used to say that when she got something in her head, there was no stopping her, and that scared him more than he ever admitted to anyone else, except maybe me. I asked her why, asked her what could possibly have happened that would lead a grown man to hand over control of his life to someone he didn't trust. She sighed, ran a hand through her thinning hair, and told me what my father never had the guts to say himself. After his Parkinson's diagnosis, Emily had pushed hard, harder than anyone expected, to restructure his finances, to transfer assets, to consolidate power for the sake of efficiency. He agreed at first, overwhelmed by the medical bills, flattered by her involvement, relieved to not have to make every decision himself. But things changed quickly. She stopped asking questions. She started making decisions in his name. She pushed him to sign documents without reading them, or more accurately, without fully understanding them. When Donna tried to intervene, tried to slow things down, Emily shut her out entirely. She even threatened to accuse Donna of meddling, of coercion, told my father he could lose everything if he kept sharing sensitive information with outsiders. That was when he withdrew. That was when he started avoiding me. Not because he didn't want to talk, but because he was ashamed that he'd let it happen, ashamed that he had picked the wrong daughter to trust. It felt like something inside me broke, like a part of my chest I didn't know was still tender had been split wide open. All those years of being dismissed, ignored, relegated to the background while Emily strutted through life with her perfect grades and perfect house and perfect lies, they hadn't just been painful, they'd been part of something deliberate. A campaign. A quiet, relentless campaign to not just be the golden child, but to erase me entirely from the equation. I thanked Donna, asked her if she'd be willing to talk to the journalist who'd been following the story, and she agreed, though I could see the fear in her eyes, not of me, but of Emily. That told me everything I needed to know. When I finally walked back into the hospital room later that evening, Emily was sitting alone, reading something on her phone, her face blank. Dad was sleeping, his breath shallow, the room filled with that heavy silence that only seems to exist near the end of things. I walked over, stood beside her, and waited until she looked up. When she did, I didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't give her the satisfaction of watching me lose control. Instead, I leaned in, smiled tightly, and whispered, "You were right, Emily. I did peak in high school. But you? You're about to crash. Hard." Her face didn't change, not right away. But something in her eyes flickered, the first sign of a crack in the perfect mask she'd worn her whole life. And I turned to Dad, kissed his forehead, and said quietly, "I forgive you. But I'm not done. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. And the truth, whatever it cost, was finally mine to tell."